Welcome to Dine Northwest. It's a radio talk show and podcast, and we look at the many facets of the hospitality industry. My name's Andy Cook.
And I'm Morgan Huther. Dine Northwest is brought to you by the Washington Hospitality Association.
Those of you who are interested may feel free to connect with our show on Facebook at facebook.com/Dine Northwest. You'll find past Dine Northwest programs, and you can also subscribe to our show on iTunes and find us on Podbean. But without further ado, today we have on the show Catharine Morisset. She's from Fisher Phillips, and she's really our go-to person in the industry for a lot of legal issues. And so without further ado, hello, Catharine. How are you?
Hi. How's everybody doing today?
Great.
We're wonderful.
Morgan, why don't you kick us off? I just feel like I feel like I'm talking too much.
Well, Catharine, can you tell us a little bit about your law firm?
Sure. I'm a partner at Fisher Phillips in the Seattle office. We're a national law firm that only represents employers or management side in all aspects of workplace law. So that's everything from a collective bargaining agreement to a EEOC charge. And then while I'm a litigator and I also handle appellate work, I do a lot of advice and counsel, as all of our attorneys do. And I work closely with the hospitality industry. I actually worked in the hospitality industry myself before I went to law school. And I really enjoy helping folks figure out what they need to do before we ever have to go to litigation. So I call it a little bit of preventative medicine so that people can actually focus on their work and their workplace and their business rather than having to spend time with lawyers in litigation.
That's a really succinct response. I appreciate that. I wasn't surprised. I mean, there's not an accident that we reached out to you because I've seen you speak in person, and you're very engaging. I think I'd also like to maybe have you back on for another topic that is relevant to the hospitality industry. So, listeners, if you enjoy this interview, I think we're going to be having Catharine back on another topic probably next week. But today we want to talk specifically about tip pooling. Tip pooling, I mean, it has any tipped establishment can be deeply affected by the dynamics of tip pooling, and the dynamics have changed. So, in your words, Catharine, what can and can't be done with tip pooling since the Trump administration came in last year? Where do we stand with tip pooling on the federal level? And then I want to talk about how it affects us on the state level.
Yeah, I appreciate you drawing the distinction. I think it's hard sometimes for folks to grasp that we've got two sets of laws, and often three if we're talking about a city, right? We'll have to worry about federal wage hour laws, state wage hour laws, and sometimes the city starts to get involved in that as well. Like we have a good example of that is minimum wage, right? Federal minimum wage is different than Washington minimum wage, which is different than Seattle minimum wage. So tip pooling on the federal level, the good news is we finally got some clarity on tip pooling, although we're waiting for it to become official, so to speak. We had some case law out of the Ninth Circuit, which is the Federal Court of Appeals that applies to businesses in Washington, that told employers that they couldn't include back-of-the-house employees in mandatory tip pools, and that was really difficult, I think, for some members and lots of folks across the industry as that minimum wage issue comes up, as the idea of not having income disparity. And I always looked at it as we want to recognize that the back of the house and the work that they do is also highly important to the service that's being provided to the customer. So it always made sense to me that this is what some restaurants wanted to think about.
Do you mind if I jump in on that point?
You bet.
I have years in the industry as well, and it's been confusing to me also, especially with the vagaries of how the law was described, and you had to have more than minimal contact with the person leaving the tip. And I think it just sort of ignored all the many diverse ways a tipping environment can be organized. But I don't need to editorialize. I'm just going to jump back.
I know it's hard not to.
Well,
it's hard not to because
we're talking about
doesn't make much sense.
Right. We're talking about clarity. You know how now we have more clarity, and when we need to define what that is, and so.
Yeah. So in March of 2018, Congress snuck in a budget bill an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's our federal wage hour law that explicitly prohibited managers, supervisors, and employers from keeping employee tips. It had no mention of back-of-the-house employees, but that bill made obsolete a prior regulation that had been interpreted to bar the back-of-the-house employees. So what we have now is nothing that says you can't do it. And in just in case that wasn't enough for folks to feel comfortable, well, we don't have a formal regulation yet from the Department of Labor. They did issue a press release with this change stating that they currently take the position that back-of-the-house employees could be included in a tip pool. So that's good news for flexibility for the members as they're thinking about how to handle these issues at the restaurant level.
So now we can include heart-of-the-house employees like our dishwashers and our cooks in tip pools. And you kind of touched on this briefly, but we're hearing from our members, and we know, I'm sure, Andy, you know, that tipping is different in every restaurant, in every establishment. But what are the rules? What parameters do we need to work within in order to make that tip pool work?
So you can have a mandatory tip pool. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to tell you to always have it in writing and communicate it with your workforce. I think if you're changing practices, you know, what I want to say, the practical advice is to talk to your employees and get input about from what they think is going to be fair. But when you roll something out, which is going to be, you know, in writing, here's how we're going to handle tips, here's how we're going to pool them, here's how we're going to who's going to be included and who's not. You know, set it so that you're saying we're going to try it out and get some feedback later. I think that's really the most important piece is the employee communication piece, because if you don't have that, then that's when you see disgruntled employees and you see claims and, frankly, just spend time on employee morale. I do see folks still doing voluntary tip pooling because they feel that they want to give the servers and such really a chance to give input. I mean, the biggest thing as far as the don'ts are, you know, you cannot include management or supervisors or the owners in the pool. You, if you're doing tips as opposed to service charges, you know, that's handled differently as far as taxes. And I know we're probably not going to talk about service charges today, but just know that they're distinct. And then the biggest thing is that you make sure that you aren't allowing any supervisory personnel to participate, that you define the percentage of what's going to whom, and that should be the basics that you need to get started.
So I have a couple points that we would both like to respond on. I'm gonna start with one, but I think Morgan really wants to find out more about how you would define the parameters around what constitutes a supervisor. But what I want to circle back to real quick is just to be super clear. The industry is very interested in this state about tip pooling as a way to sort of balance out wage inequity and to help retain a better workplace culture and reward structure for the back-of-house people. And what I'm hearing is that there are many ways that you can do it. That best practices and this is from a legal expert, best practices is to start off on a more experimental tone and to keep your employees well informed as to what the experiment parameters are. And okay, thank you. I appreciate your validation. And that. One thing that I feel is super important to point out, and Morgan's probably rolling her eyes, but that's why I'm not looking at her right now, is that tipping out is also tip pooling. We talk about tip pooling, and that leaves a sort of a perception that everything goes into a pot and is redistributed. But tip sharing, 2% to the busser, 1% to the bartender, to the expediter, etc. That also kind of falls under the larger umbrella term of tip pooling. Would you agree? Can you validate me again?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Oh, thank you.
I think that the term is used to cover really as you said, the one giant pot, or the tipping out at various percentages for folks, and then mandatory versus voluntary.
Yeah, and for the uninitiated to the industry, the way that would work in my view, for a lot of kitchens are. In a lot of full-service restaurants, you are tipping out something around 2% to a busser. The server is the primary tip funnel. A percent to the bartender, a percent to the expediter if there is one, and then it kind of hits a funny hybrid because you're not going to go around and tip every single cook individually. That would be ridiculous. You would be going into a fund that would be distributed to the kitchen based on a whole variety of different factors: hours worked, positions, responsibilities, etc. Do you have experiences with hospitality organizations that are asking you these kind of questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I get these kinds of questions all the time, and the solutions are as numerous as the different questions that I get. I mean, I even have, know some folks where they let the employees come up with what the formula is going to be for hours worked, for how you participated, what you were doing. I have some folks in the industry tell me that their servers don't want to share with anybody, and then maybe they make a decision to address the back of the house wages differently. I see everything in between probably those extremes of what folks decide to do for their restaurant. I think that maybe even realizing that you have this flexibility now can be helpful. But I still see folks just do a mandatory tip pool. All tips are pooled, and here's how we're going to share them, and off we go to the races. I think one thing that I did leave out, Andy, is to remind everybody that Washington is not a tip credit state. So everybody needs to be getting minimum wage no matter what, and then we're talking about the tips on top of that.
I want to really stress and reiterate something you said. Communicating up front with your staff, we have to manage those expectations in order to ensure that everybody is on board when we establish these tip pools. And I also want to push, you mentioned supervisors are not allowed to participate in the tip pool under the current rules. What constitutes a supervisor? And also, is that different in Washington versus at the national level?
Ooh, I knew you were going to ask the hard question. So the federal rules have given no legal clarity on who is a supervisor or a manager. There's nothing in the amendment from the FLSA. And to your point, we have different definitions that sometimes, with some parts matching and some parts not, as far as Washington versus federal law. But generally, a manager would be the clear example of that is somebody who you've determined is otherwise exempt under the overtime rules, perhaps under the executive exemption, which is long and detailed, so I won't go into it here.
Thank you.
That's not just getting paid a salary. There's some duty portions that they have to meet as well. And then the supervisor, we may be taking a look at, it would be really a job-specific question that unfortunately I can't give a blanket answer to because these are all fact-specific questions. But if you've got a shift lead, we're in the area where that person may not be somebody who can participate in the tip pool. It's probably going to come down to a question of if they are performing server duties, and that, in the back of the house or the heart of the house would be looking at whether they're in charge of, for example, the entire kitchen, then they're managing that as an executive. They have the power to hire and fire people, and they direct more, 2 or more full-time employees. Those kinds of people who fit into those categories could not participate in the tip pool.
So
I think Washington would follow that as well.
So I'm just going to kind of start splitting hairs to hopefully shore up my ignorance. I'm not looking to you for a cure for that, by the way. But so is it about, like when I was in the industry, I would clock in and I'd have all these different job classes because I would do supervisory stuff or bartending stuff. And so is that where really what it comes down to when you are clocked on? What are the specificities of your title? Or is it more about what your responsibilities are? Like let's say that I could influence who gets sent home when. Does that make me a supervisor? Or does me being clocked in and identified as someone with a leadership kind of title?
It depends on what your actual job duties are, and it depends on, believe it or not, this is why wage hour law can be such a pain, it is a work week by work week analysis.
Okay.
So, if 1 week all you're doing is waiting tables, then you're not an exempt employee, you're an hourly employee, and you could participate in the tip pool. If the next week, it turns out, in fact, now we've appointed you the head supervisor of of all of the supers, of all of the servers, you are now hiring, firing, making decisions about that. It wouldn't necessarily be sending somebody home. It'd have to be a higher level decision-making authority.
Okay.
That would put you into this category. Then we would start to look about whether you're overtime exempt. I guess what I'm saying is I have a feeling that what we're going to see shake out from federal and state law is looking to the definition of supervisor or manager that may fit under the overtime exemptions, but it is complex. I mean, it's one of the things that before I would encourage any member to classify somebody as who's in a gray area, whether they can participate in the tip pool and whether they're overtime exempt or not, you really should reach out for some legal advice. Well, it's a common area, and just as a side note, I've seen the state go after some folks in this industry for misclassification like that, and then you get stuck paying overtime and things, so it can be a dangerous area.
Right. Well, you actually did clarify a point that we've been debating around the office. We've had some people reach out and say, I am so super confused. I mean, we understand the clay's still wet, but we also don't want to knock this thing into a blob. For a lot of operators, especially small operators, that's kind of part of a compensation model. They have a high value, maybe a front of house employee, someone who's receiving tips, and to manage their management labor, they'll their manager goes home and the server closes the place up. But that also means that the server is sort of the last person there and is kind of juggling a few balls at the time. It sounds like. Well, just give me some clarity on this. Is what you just said, does that mean that, this person doesn't have the power to hire or fire, they're just closing the place up. Does that count them as a manager?
With the usual lawyer caveat that it depends, that person starts to sound to me like they are not the manager category. Of course, I want to know more about them, whether they're starting to seem like a supervisor or not. But, if it just happens to be that Catherine's closing the restaurant that day, I don't think I'm suddenly unable to participate in the tip pool.
Oh, that's actually, that makes it crystal clear to me because I've been in that position. It's like, Andy, you don't have any power here. We just want you to lock the place up and make sure the safe is closed.
You bet.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you. But I'm going to reinforce that legal caveat that it depends. So don't take Andy's word on it. He's a fool. Call Catherine.
My experience is all in quick service, so it was just kind of like fast and loose. You're closing or you're opening, but nobody was really a manager.
That happens all the time.
So are we going to see more litigation, more legal battles around this in the future, or do we think that the dust is starting to settle?
Well, can I take out my crystal ball and let's assume that my crystal ball may be on the fritz this morning, but... Does it have
etched into it the legal disclaimer?
Yep. So my crystal ball is on the fritz, my legal disclaimer. I am concerned about what Washington State's going to do. Uh-huh. And that's because I'm always concerned about what Washington State's going to do. We have a long history of being pro-employee.
Yeah.
And remember that, a couple sentences about tips and service charges got snuck into the paid sick leave initiative, right? Mm-hmm. So, right now, what we like to see is the state just backing out of this and saying it's been settled on the federal level, and we're not going to get into it and try to come up with our own interpretation of what it means when tips must be paid to the employee. That's the language that we have in the new law, and my argument is as long as they're an employee and not a manager or supervisor, then you can have a tip pool, mandatory or involuntary, of all these different permutations that we have. I know that we've been working to see some FAQs come out. I understand, at least informally from some folks in the know, that the state has now decided to go through a formal rulemaking process. When that happens, means the whole thing gets slowed down. Labor, other business interests, and such have the opportunity to chime in about what they think the regulation should mean. And if we have formal rulemaking, it's going to take longer before we get some guidance. So, there's nothing right now that says you can't do it, but the, cautious person would put a asterisk next to it and know to keep checking back with the association to see if there's any developments. There's been, even under the old scheme, lawsuits about making folks participate in mandatory tip pools, even servers and things. And, the plaintiff's bar here is very active. And in Washington, if you fail to pay somebody wages that they're owed, and it's pretty clear it was a legal problem, it's automatic doubling, and you have the pleasure of paying the other side's attorney's fees. So they can be pretty steep cases. With big risk, which is why we're always a little bit cautious.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people we hear from, they just want to be compliant, but it's a morass. They don't really know. It doesn't follow the same application of common sense that they apply to other things in their life. That's not a criticism. Just being just carefully worded sentences. So with a little bit of time we have left. Would you take a look in your crystal ball and tell us what we haven't talked about that's important?
So I think, I'm just going to reiterate some things that we've already said,
Perfect.
Which is you've got nothing right now prevents anybody from including back or heart of the house in a tip pool. Nothing prevents anybody from having it be a mandatory tip pool. So that's the state of the law that we've got right now. Remember, we've got no tip credit, so we're talking about anything, left by the customer and ensuring people were already paid minimum wage, whether it's Seattle or Washington State, to begin with. To Morgan's and my point is engage your workforce before you make any changes. I think that pays off in the long run in terms of morale, and also it's good risk management. If you've got folks buy-in and are getting input, you're going to have happier employees, and we want employees to come to work and work hard and have a good time while they're there and not be concerned about pay issues. You'll need to decide what percentage of tips should be pooled. If you're doing service charges instead, that's a whole nother issue. So let's table that for a different discussion or some other advice. There are different compensation plans that we haven't talked about, like commissions and stuff. That's not what we're talking about today. And I think, when you listen to your employees, you might get some information that will put you towards a policy that makes more sense as well. So, and I think the last piece we didn't talk about is remember that tips generally greater than $30 a month are taxable wages for payroll tax purposes. So the employer has a duty to report those and make payroll taxes on them, and the employee has a duty to report them as well too. So best practice again is to ensure that that's been communicated to your employees.
Right. And whatever you implement, be sure to put it in writing and make sure that everyone has agreed to the wording that you put into writing.
Absolutely.
Catharine, where can people find out more about you? How can people connect to you? It's like I loved hearing that woman and how she suffered through Andy's ridiculous questions. I want to talk to her. I want to talk to her in a real way. How do people do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. My last name is spelled Morisset. Probably the best way to find me is to also go to my firm's website, which is Fisher, Fisher, Phillips with a P, and look up the Seattle office, and you'll see my smiling face if you look at the attorneys who are here. You also might think about catching me at next time we do a round of summits. I've had the pleasure of being invited to speak a couple times. And you can also find me through the advisory network. I work on basically handling hotline employment law calls for members of the association as well from time to time. So that's another way to connect with me through the association.
All right. So it's the Washington Hospitality Association. You can find us online. Thank you, Catharine, for being on Dine Northwest, where we get to explore the hospitality industry of the great state of Washington. Only on Dine Northwest, here on KLAY AM 1180, your conversation station.
Bye.